Hi, my name's James Potthoff. I'm the district forester with the DNR. A lot of you may be wondering, what the heck does a forester do? Well, my job is to help people plant trees, grow trees, and then when they get big enough, cut them down and grow more. I help private landowners manage timber. And when I say timber, I mean their woods. If you own 10, 20, 50, 100 acres, I can come out there and help a landowner manage it. A lot of people ask me, well, James, why do we need to manage a woods? The trees grow all by themselves. And I say, sure, you bet they do. So does my garden. I plant it, it grows, but if I don't go out there and weed the garden occasionally and water it and take care of it, I'm going to have some pretty scrawny tomatoes by the time harvest comes around. Same thing applies in the woods. If you manage your woods, the things you want to grow best will grow best. And the things you don't want to grow, we can get rid of. Here in the forest, one of the main things we have to worry about are invasive species. It doesn't matter what you're managing for. A lot of different landowners have a lot of different objectives when they're managing their woods. Some are managing for timber production, others are managing for wildlife habitat. Doesn't matter if it's I want to shoot deer with my rifle or shotgun or bow or even my camera. You're managing for the same thing. But no matter what you're managing for in your woods, the first thing you have to deal with are invasive species. And this is an invasive species right here. Invasive species means it takes over an area very quickly. It has no natural predators, and exotic means it comes from a different area. That could be a different county, different state, different region, or even different hemisphere. It's important that we take care of these because these can actually destroy a forest. They take over and prevent the native plants from growing, which can have a hugely negative effect on our forest. It'll actually keep, some of these invasives will prevent native trees from regenerating, so we actually lose our forest over time. So we want to make sure we take care of these. This one right here, this is called multiflora rose. This one was brought over on purpose by the federal government back in the 1950s for use as living fencing. It's got fairly large thorns on it. Here's a picture of it right here, a little close up. It's got thorns all over it. It takes over the understory in a forest and prevents native plants from growing. And also, every time I walk in the woods, I come out with bloody thighs because of all these lovely thorns on here. So I'm not a big fan of this one. It prevents trees from growing, and my job is to grow trees, so therefore I need to manage this. We have many, many different invasive species here in the park and all over Indiana. We've got bush honeysuckle is a very common one we find here in the forest. Autumn olive is very common along the edges. We've got oriental bittersweet, garlic mustard, and on and on and on. Ideally, we don't have all of those in one woods, but we tackle all of them and try to prevent them from getting in the woods and keeping them at least in a manageable level to where we can continue to grow trees. Many different landowners have many different objectives for their woods, how they want to manage their woods. Typically, most landowners want to manage for timber production and wildlife habitat. Timber production basically means I want to get income out of my woods. I want to harvest timber occasionally and recoup some money from it, just like a crop field. Wildlife habitat typically means I either want to shoot the deer with my shotgun, rifle, or my camera. Doesn't really matter. We still manage the woods in the same way. The great thing about managing timber and managing wildlife, we can do them both at the same time. They are not mutually exclusive. We can do them both at the same time. While I grow these trees out here, we've got walnut out here, we've got oak, we've got cherry. Those are all great timber species, but they also all produce seeds for wildlife. Oak produces acorns, walnuts produce walnuts, cherries produce cherries, and wildlife eat those species. So it's handy to have those around. Harvesting the timber, sure, we're destroying trees, but we're also making space for more trees to grow when we do harvest them. A lot of people say, well, James, when you harvest timber, don't the tree huggers give you an issue? Don't they give you a hard time? You must really hate tree huggers. And I tell folks, I am a tree hugger. I love trees. As soon as I hug them all the time, I wrap my arms around them. As soon as I can't touch my fingers on the far side, I cut them down and I grow more because it's time for them to go. A forest is nothing to me but a big garden. We harvest crops, we plant crops, and just repeat the process consistently. Out here in the forest, we grow lots of different species. We have oak, walnut, cherry, tulip, hickory, hackberry. You know, literally hundreds of different species here in Indiana grow around here. Some are more valuable than others. So we manage our forests. We weed the garden. We get rid of some of the lower quality species by killing them and favor the good stuff. Trees need three things to grow in order for them to survive, just like any other plant. They need water, nutrients, and sunlight. We've got plenty of water around here and plenty of nutrients. Trees are not like crops like corn and soybeans where they need irrigated and fertilized. These trees are native to this area. They've grown around here for thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. They're used to this climate. They're used to this soils. They are good. And even if they weren't good, we're not going to irrigate and fertilize the woods, so they're not an issue. Sunlight is typically our limiting factor for tree growth. And basically, Forestry 101 is making sure your trees have enough sunlight to grow. So if you have a high quality walnut that's growing here, but it's surrounded by a bunch of low value elm and hackberry, if you kill those hackberry and elm off, guess what? Your walnut has more sun, it can grow faster, it'll put on more leaves, which means it's growing more timber. Also, happy, healthy, vigorously growing trees are going to produce more seed. More seed means more food for wildlife and more young walnut trees coming up for the next generation. In addition to that, happy, healthy, vigorously growing trees also can fight off diseases and insect outbreaks much more readily than trees that are under stress. If you've got that little walnut tree surrounded by a bunch of other trees and they're just struggling to survive on a good day, if we get a bug or an insect that comes in after them, or a disease, that could easily kill a tree that's malnourished. Just like if you had a malnourished high schooler, you get the common cold, that could kill you. Whereas if you're well fed like I am, I get the common cold, I cough for a few days, and then I move on. And that's how we want our forest to be growing. We want it to be growing vigorously and healthy at all times. And that means sometimes we have to thin the herd. And that's okay. It's just, I compare it to pulling weeds around my tomatoes in my garden at home. I would be called a very poor gardener if I didn't pull my weeds. But if I start killing trees in the woods, sometimes people get upset about it. But we're just managing the forest for our objectives. All right, we're just deciding what's going to grow best in our woods. And that's just basic forest management. If we want to grow timber, hey, guess what? This walnut tree here, we're going to thin out around this and make sure he grows best. If we're managing for wildlife, maybe I want to keep the oak because it's producing acorns. If I'm a deer hunter, oaks produce acorns, deer like acorns, we keep the oak around. Now, a nice thing about both those species, walnut and oak, they're good for wildlife and they're good for timber. So like I said, we can manage for both at the same time. All right, in addition to managing for timber and managing for wildlife habitat, one of the main objectives of having forests is to also manage for water quality. Here at Tippecanoe River State Park, obviously we're near the Tippecanoe River. It's actually just about 100 yards down that way. We're up here on the high ground, rarely floods up here. We have drier site species like oak, walnut, cherries up here, things like that. You get down just a few feet, you drop 6, 8, 10 feet, and the species composition in this forest changes totally. We've got silver maple down there, cottonwood, sycamore, wet site species that are used to flooding. Those areas down there flood every year, sometimes multiple times during the year. You get 8, 10, 12 feet of water down there very easily. And it'll last there for a good portion, sometimes a few weeks. It'll stay down there with high water. And that can be problematic for certain species, which is why wet site species grow down in wet areas and dry site species grow up here. Nature will select which ones grow best in those areas. Another great thing about having forests along a stream like this in a river is these forests act like a big filter, like a big sponge. Across the road from the park, we have a lot of crop fields, and crop fields get a lot of fertilizer put on them. They also get a lot of herbicide and pesticides put on them, and they also do a lot of tillage. So we have bare soil over there. We get 6 inches of rain, and if you have a crop field right next to a river, you get 6 inches of rain, those herbicides, pesticides, and soil flow with the water right into the river, and that becomes pollution in our rivers, which is a big problem. Having a forest in between filters all that out. The forest will slow down the water, the fast-moving water will slow down, and once it's slowing down, the soil that it's carrying will distribute onto the forest floor and stop. The water, when it slows down, will absorb into the ground, all the little holes in the forest floor, little holes from earthworms, So it's very important that we keep our streams forested on the edges, because they act like good wildlife corridors for wildlife to live in and travel on. They're also good for water quality, and they also do produce really high quality timber that you can actually make a decent living off of. So in total, forestry is all about managing for sunlight. We're trying to manage for timber, we're trying to manage for wildlife, water quality, a lot of different uses for timber and forest ground. It's just important that we keep growing trees, because I always want to make sure we have trees, because eventually if we run out of trees, it's a bad day, because we will run out of my favorite forest product. My favorite forest product is toilet paper. And I don't ever want to wake up someday when I'm 80 years old and sit down and say, oh look, we're out of toilet paper, and be really out of toilet paper. We've all been there this spring. Nobody wants to be there anymore, so let's make sure we're always growing more trees. We can harvest them, that's fine, but let's make sure we grow more, so that way we always have plenty of everything we need. But tree planting has helped incredibly with water quality. Behind us here, we have tree planting. It was put in here about 12 years ago, maybe 13 years ago. This field behind me used to be cropped. It was in corn and soybean rotation, just like every other crop field in the area. They farmed directly adjacent to the river. Every time they tilled up that field, every time they put herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers on there, and it would rain, all of those pollutants would come directly into the river. Plus, they had an additional issue of flooding. That field would flood pretty consistently. Every other year they would have a hard time getting into that field. It was very important to the landowners to try to convert that property to some other use, because cropping wasn't the best use for that ground. They couldn't get a consistent crop out of the field, so we tried something else. Through a program called the Conservation Reserve Program, that's through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the federal government, they converted this ground. They planted 600-700 trees to an acre, little seedlings, and planted the whole field to trees. The trees have been here, like I said, 13-14 years. They've gotten established, well established. A lot of that, they're all wet site species, a lot of sycamore, silver maple. We mixed in some bur oak, swamp white oak, and various other species that can handle being flooded for moderate amounts of time. But you can see a lot of sycamore has come in right on the edge there. A lot of that has volunteered in it. It's come in totally naturally, all by itself, and it has all become well established, and now it's holding the soil in place. All right, you can see we've got some pretty significant erosion going on because we are on the outside corner of the river, so there's a lot of kinetic energy as the water moves downstream. It's cutting away at that bank. But luckily, those trees that have been there for 15 years, well, 12, 13, 14 years, are holding the soil in place. You can see the roots of the trees over there. They're helping hold that soil in place and slowing down the erosion. There's really no good way to stop erosion, but we can slow it down significantly where it's not a severe issue. In addition to holding the soil in place, those trees are also filtering out a lot of pollutants out of the streams, fertilizers, herbicides, and the sediment that comes out of the river, or comes out of the fields. There's a crop field just a quarter mile back that way, but now we have a quarter-mile buffer of these trees that are going to prevent a lot of those pollutants from getting in the stream. Also, the amount of water coming off of those fields is slowed down by these trees and slowly released over time into the stream, rather than getting direct flow of water off those fields into the water, into the stream here. And that's going to help prevent flooding issues down the road. So overall, this site was very poor crop ground. It grew corn well in dry years, but most years it would flood. And converting it over to trees helped make sure that the water quality of the property and the stream here was increased dramatically. And also, the landowner is still getting paid through that federal grant or federal program. The landowner is still getting paid through the Conservation Reserve Program to keep the trees on the property. So it's a win-win for everybody.